At this point, I mean, if you're getting set up and you want to make sure that you're going to have everything done, and you can run it for a little bit. Some people will like to run it and crust the surface over on their tillage system, or run it just to make sure that everything's happening just right. It's kind of up to you on what you want to show and how you go about that. We're just going to turn it on and let it run and see how it goes. The first thing I want people to notice is to watch the backboard and the places where there's bare soil. You'll see how the soil is splashing up on that whiteboard. That's what that display board is for. And the reason you tell them about that the very first is to get their attention on it. But once that board is wet and the soil doesn't stick on it as well as it does after it's got wet. So point that out and tell them about the display. Tell them what you're seeing. Describe how what's happening with it. And when you start seeing things happening on the surfaces of the pans, explain that. I like to point out that on my bare soils that I'm starting to see that those aggregates are starting to fall apart, and they're starting to move around on the surface. And as that starts to get a little more saturated and wet, then it'll start to move off. You notice on the alfalfa, the infiltration on it isn't all that great. You're seeing the surface of it. You're starting to see a little bit of puddling with that, and you can see a little bit more of a glisten to it. But as you watch that, you'll start seeing a little bit more as this starts to wet up. You can point out how much is going on in the rain gauge, is how much rain you've put on. This is your time just to describe what you're talking about with soil health and what you're trying to get across to them. If you'd like to stop it in the middle of your presentation, you notice that this one will stop without having any drip off of it. And then you can start talking about how the change in the surface is on these pans and what you're seeing with that sort of stuff. It also, when you stop that on a pan like this, it gives a chance for that soil to start to consolidate and crust over on the surface. So when you turn that back on, you may see more runoff off of this surface as possible. And I like to explain to our people is that when you've planted that field and that's the condition, is that one little quarter of an inch of rain may do that to you. Well, the next inch and a half of rain may not have near as much effect as you think it does, because you've sealed that surface over, and you can't go back in there and fix that. You have to just accept what Mother Nature has provided for you there. Now, if you're in a setup where you may not have as much time, you can jack the slopes up on these a little bit if you want to see your runoff happen a little bit faster. And you can also increase the pressure if you want to have more intense rain on it. This is running around 5 or 6 pounds of pressure, which is for the nozzle is basically right for about a 10-year storm. You'll notice we're getting some puddling on the surface of this center pan. This was absolutely dry, and we're starting to see a little bit of runoff. But look at the no-till jar behind on this second jar back here. That's infiltration water that's going right straight through that pan. And so you can describe the root systems, the pore spaces, there's probably wormholes, what have you, on a soil that's had a chance to consolidate. Now you're starting to see more runoff. The more we get on that, and there's a lot more soil splashing because that soil is liquefied, and it's going to be moving quite a bit more. Now that you're getting to this stage, you're starting to see more runoff. You're seeing more runoff off the alfalfa field. You can talk about a monoculture versus a polyculture. You can talk about compaction. You can talk about all sorts of things that may be happening. But you also see you're getting quite a bit more infiltration through that. This one's strictly runoff off of that field. This one was a bared till soil and with 100% cover on it, but the water is actually going into the soil with that one. That could be a condition of that kind of soil. If we'd had duplicate soils, we might actually see the same thing, but it may not. So you'll just have to try some of these. You notice there's no infiltration water off of this one, there is off of that one, and there's just barely starting to get infiltration off of the pasture pan. And my assumption is what that is that you're getting a lot more water holding capacity with the higher organic matter, higher organic soils. I also like to point out the color of the water that's coming through these trays is you may have like the alfalfa water and the grass water, the water that's coming through there is much clearer than it is through the farm soils. And you're going to get some organic staining from the organic matter that's in those soils, and those are all certain things that you can pull out to start describing that. As far as how long you want to run your demonstration, it kind of depends on what your show is, how much time you have. You may want to run it till the jars are full. You may want to just run it till you have a good impression of what's actually happening with it if you don't have a lot of time. If you're trying to make a high impact and show what's happening in the subsurface of these soils, then you can get it to the point where you see that 90% of the water that's going on there is actually running off of that, and then stop it and pull those pans and flip those over and show how much water actually penetrated that. We'll run it for just a little bit more and see what we get. Some of the things that you're going to want to point out in this is, first off, is you remember that this was a fairly crumbly surface on this conventional pan, and so now it's virtually flat, sealed over. But you can also see how it's settled in the pan, how it's lower up on that end and it's more full on the front end. That's soil erosion. That's the runoff, and it settled in the front part of the pan before it had it could come over the edge of that. And also I'd like you to notice that around this pan, all the soil that's been splashed out of that pan from the lack of cover. This one over here was a tilled up soil, but as you pull that residue back, you can see a lot of the aggregates that were on that surface are still intact, and that pounding of the raindrop has a big impression or a big impact on how long that surface can stay broke up. So you can see even this large clod here is still intact, and there's still a porous surface on it, which reflects back into the amount of water that actually went through the infiltration part of it. There's actually no water that ran off of this one because all the water would have gone into the pan. This no-till surface that has a consolidated surface that's probably got root systems and earthworm tunnels and all sorts of porosity, and allows that water to flow into that pan under gravity flow. And so you can see how much water actually went through that. Started to get a little bit of runoff, but not a whole lot. The alfalfa pan, being it's a monoculture, probably doesn't have the microorganisms in it that this system would. So you probably have a harder surface, more compaction in that field, and so you've got a little bit more runoff, but still had quite a bit of infiltration. And then, of course, the prairie soil was pretty much all infiltration on that one. Okay, might want to pick this open and see what that crust looks like a little bit. And then what we're going to do next is we're going to take this and flip this over on the tarp here to show you what's actually happened below the surface. This is the conventionally tilled soil that had no cover on it. As you can see, we still have dry soil in this pan. This is the runoff, and this was the infiltration. And let's do this pan with the straw. And this is the runoff. And that was with the cover on it. And as you can see, even though this is, the soil structure is really pretty poor, you still got a lot of water in there just by having a surface cover on there. And so then this is the infiltration water for that one. As you're doing this demonstration, flipping these pans has got a tremendous impact, and you can work with this where you get the right soils, you get the right conditions on it, you get the right pan, and when you can flip that pan over and you see the dust roll out of that, that makes a pretty big impression on your audience with that. When you get ready to flip, there's kind of a technique to it. You don't want to do it slow. Otherwise you'll end up dumping a bunch of soil on your shoes. And so you get it set and flip it and let it slap down good and tight so that it'll. And for me, I'll do the ones that I'd like to flip, the ones that I've had to work the least with. If I've had to go out and cut those pans, I'm a little reserved about having to go do that again. So you can put these together and save these and use for multiple demonstrations, unless of course you want to show what's going on underneath there. And so it's, from this point, it's kind of up to your imagination and how well, or how you put your presentations together. If you're doing small groups or several groups in a row, I would recommend maybe doing 3 pans instead of 5. You have a lot more work to do, unless you can of course have the grass pans and not be afraid to run those over and over and over, because they basically work the same way. But if you have like a envirothon or something where you're doing schools with lots of children coming through and you want to show several different ones, and you can just fill 2 pans at a time and cycle those through without having to do near as much work. And so you need to kind of have that all set up ahead of time.